Sounds like the door to a Radio Shack.
Next caller, please. So if anyone else joins, they can join in. But I guess we'll get started. Let me change. So I do want to thank you for coming out to this. I think this is a good thing that we're doing, an important thing, and something that COVID has sort of made us do a little bit more is do virtual options. And but we also wanted to make it accessible for those that maybe can't walk or who live out of state or out of the county or wherever that can't make it to these. So we want to be able to offer this as a way to still teach you a little bit. And I hope that you walk away or sit away, it's not walking, sit away with a little bit more information about Leila Ross Wilburn and the MAK district, but more broadly, how she fits into the larger context of architecture at that time. So as you can see, I'm not going to physically walk down the street. That would be a little hard to do, but instead I'll just kind of do a PowerPoint. And one of the benefits of doing it virtually is I actually have more photographs and a little bit more info to kind of get you a better overview of Leila Ross Wilburn. Before we begin, here it is. I do want to say that this tour and presentation would be impossible to do if it were not for Susan Hunter's work and also Miriam Mathura's work in the MAK district. And this book has been an absolute gem of a resource. It's a beautiful coffee table book. I highly recommend if you're interested. And I know it's backwards. I can't fix that, but it's just Southern Homes and Plan book, and it's all about Wilburn. And you can find it at online, but I recommend actually Eagle Eye Bookstore because it's a local bookstore that we do a lot of things with. So go see Doug over there and he'll order you one of these books. And it really goes through in more detail than what I can even cover in just this hour on her and all of her plans and examples of the houses that are still around. So this would not be done without their work. But we are talking about the MAK neighborhood and Wilburn. So to kind of start it off, Wilburn was born in 1885 in Macon. Her mother went to Wesleyan down in Macon. About 7 years later, her family moved to Decatur. And a couple years later, she attended Agnes Scott Institute. At that time, her family actually moved to Adams Street. So with that, I'll actually start the actual tour and pictures. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So, you know, there's not a lot of photographs of Wilburn, but so let me see. There you go. This can you see my pointer? Just want to make sure you can see it. because I'll do a lot of pointing.
Yes.
Okay, so this is Wilburn, and this is a house that we'll talk about in a second. But this is actually, I believe this is probably when Wilburn, after she graduated Agnes Scott Institute, she spent 2 years there, graduated, and then started to travel the country, taking photographs of houses and just getting inspired. So she took about 5,000 photographs, and this looks like the kind of image that she took while probably out on that tour, just getting inspired. So there we go. The map on the left is actually, and I forgot what year this map is. It's a very early map, but this is really focusing on the MAK district, and the one on the right is actually the MAK district. So we're talking about 10 square blocks. The MAK district is called because of McDonough, which is here, Adams, and Kings Highway. So it's the first locally designated historic districts in Decatur, which means that as a local historic district, any changes to the exterior of the home have to go through an approval process. So one big change about the neighborhood is the fact that Beacon Hill, which used to be called Renfro, but Beacon Hill takes up this entire block, which that is this block right here. And Wilburn lived with her family actually in this house here. It is all gone. It is now the middle school that was built in the 1970s. So if you go there today, it's a little bit of sad irony, the fact that we actually start our tour on benches on Beacon Hill's property, which is literally a few feet from where her home was. But she lived in the neighborhood with her family and lived there for her entire life. Her sister also lived there for a long time on Adams Street as well. So the majority of development in Decatur at the time, residential development, was focusing closer to the city square on the north side of the tracks. In 1909, Mason and Weeks, they were Pullman Mason and John Weeks. Pullman Weeks and John Mason, they were two business owners in Decatur. They actually bought this entire, or a lot of the tract of land here, and they were going to develop this area. This was all prime, empty real estate. There were a few homes, primarily along College, but for the most part, it was just empty. Fun fact, there is actually the Decatur Fair. It was actually on the Wild Center property, which is over in this kind of general area. One of the major contributing factors to this area being prime real estate is the fact that it's on two car lines, trolley lines. You have one trolley line that ran here and the other one that ran on Oakview, which is why this road is curvy and fun. And actually Oakview continues all the way through Kirkwood, still curvy, and just south of Oakland Cemetery, and goes straight into downtown, which was perfect for all of these new residents in this neighborhood, including Wilburn. So I'll kind of back it up for a second. Wilburn, after she came back from traveling out west and around the country taking photographs, she had only a private lesson as a draftsperson under her belt, no other real architectural training or skills. She came back and began work as a draftsperson with a company called Paget and Sons, and their office was in downtown. 3 years later, she went out on her own and created her own company, which I think is astonishing. And that's literally how it went. She did private lessons. She came back, she was a draftsperson for a couple of years and got her first commission, which is, I'll show you in the next slide, sorry. So this is actually, they were starting to sell off lots in this property. And unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the lots that Pullman and Weeks did. A lot of their advertisements were in the newspaper, and it was also in the DeKalb New Era, one of the editions that we don't have. But the other company that was developing this property is East Rivers Realty. But I just wanted to show what they were and how they were advertising it. So this is along Kings Highway, which was also built at that same time in the same neighborhood. And they were offering the fact that it's Agnes Scott College. What else? They mentioned that the sidewalks were paved, that there were city improvements, and of course the trolley line. And that's one thing that they're always mentioning, is that it was close to the trolley line. Pullman and Weeks, they were the ones that were mainly developing Adams, and they had a few restrictions. They wanted all the homes at first to be 2 stories, and it would be exclusive. So the cost would be about $3,000 to $5,000 for a home. Lots were about $700. So what was going on though around the country and right before Wilburn? Well, there were these houses. These are just kind of generic houses to show what the styles were at that time. Queen Anne, folk Victorian, which is really referring to this house, especially with all of the spindle work. A lot of times you might see it with sort of modest examples of barge board, kind of gingerbread trim. Here's a little bit more of a higher style. This was kind of one of the styles that was going on. So we have very houses with a lot of details, and we start to see a little bit of a reaction. So one of the reactions that was coming out after the Victorian era styles is the arts and crafts movement, and more specifically, the craftsmen. The craftsman movement originally began in London, England, around the late 19th century. The arts and crafts movement with William Morris. You may have seen his beautiful wallpaper. But they were also trying to get back to craftsmen developing houses or building it really by hand and making your house look like it was built by hand, even though by this point, these houses were all mass produced, and all of these rafters and the little details were all mass produced. So it started in England, it came to the United States. Around 1905 is when it really started in Southern California. And it also coincided with the bungalow, which came out of California also. It was often called a California bungalow for a long time. But this is just from Santa Monica. And I'm not sure where this one is, but it's just, we've all seen these craftsmen. The other style that no doubt Wilburn would have seen and be inspired by was the prairie movement. The prairie movement is also kind of under this larger umbrella of the arts and crafts movement, but more specifically American. And the prairie movement, the most famous examples are all by Frank Lloyd Wright. But this one emphasizes long horizontal lines, low-pitched roof. This one has great details under the roof line. And so this is also what Wilburn definitely would have been inspired by and seeing at the same time during her travels. And then also what was happening, but not quite yet, but there were some early examples, were the Tudor revival style. I think we always associated a little bit more with the 1920s and 30s. But the Tudor revival was actually happening a couple of decades earlier, and this would have also been kind of creeping up, and there would have been definitely influences that Wilburn would have seen. Particularly this house on the right, I want you to pay attention to the fact that it has three gables, two symmetrical ones. This style of Tudor revival was actually more common pre-1920s. After 1920s, you start to see the Tudor revival with all of the fun asymmetrical details. But actually keep these two in mind because we'll see a couple of examples that look very similar to these two houses. So this was actually Wilburn's very first commission. I have no idea the story behind it. I'm sure it would be a crazy story, but this is actually the gym on the Georgia Military Academy's, which is now Woodward Academy. I don't believe the building is in existence, or if it is in existence, it's been kind of built over and built around, but this is the gymnasium. It was originally the YMCA gymnasium that Georgia Military Academy used, and this was in 1911, and this is their first commission. So Wilburn, she's at her office, and her office is actually in the Peters building in downtown. She has her own company. Her office though is filled with other tradespeople, so people that do lumber and brick. And she decides very early on that she's going to be a plan book architect and design plan books and plans for people. So early on, she pushes advertising, and not just advertising in Atlanta, but she's advertising in Fort Worth in 1914, in Birmingham, Alabama in 1914. This one's a little bit later, but this is her 1922 plan book. So she's just producing plan after plan after plan in advertising. There's some other fun advertisements. This one, Homes of Individuality and Own Your Own Home. So what I actually learned about the Own Your Own Home, in the early 1920s, there was actually a major push to educate and to encourage people to own their own home. And there was actually a conference even in Atlanta and in Macon. And Wilburn was an exhibitor at this conference that basically was all about like picking your plans, but also just educating you on how you can, in fact, own your own home. Okay. So before we begin, I do want to just mention a few things that'll, again, put things a little bit more in context. So I sort of jumped right into plan books and Wilburn on her own. And I can't emphasize this enough that that was extremely unusual, but also kind of incredible that she was just completely doing things her own way. There wasn't a standard to be an architect at the time. It was kind of you could kind of go back and forth between calling yourself a draftsperson or an architect. To officially be part of AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, which started to formalize architecture as a trade. There were a few stipulations, though, to join the local Atlanta chapter, which started in 1906. So if you wanted to become an architect in 1906 and join AIA, you either had to be at least 30 years old, graduate from an accredited school, or pass the Royal Institute of British Architect exam. In the US, the only schools were MIT, Columbia, UPenn, Cornell, Harvard, and University of Illinois. Georgia Tech began offering courses in 1910, but it wasn't until World War II that allowed women. You could have experience as an architect for 3 years or a draft for 5. Registration, though, of architects was first required in 1920 for private practice. So Wilburn did register in the state of Georgia as an architect. She was actually the second registered architect in Georgia. The first one was Henrietta Dozier. She was only an architect in Georgia for just a couple of years. But for a while, Wilburn was the only female architect in Georgia. And she never was hiding the fact that she was a female architect. In fact, she was using it to her advantage. And yeah, not hiding the fact. A lot of times, or you might assume she might go under an alias or might put herself, as Ross Wilburn, maybe in books. No, she was calling herself Miss Leila Ross Wilburn. And if you notice, all of these selected by Leila Ross Wilburn architect. Leila Ross Wilburn architect, Leila Ross Wilburn architect. So she definitely was putting forth the fact that she was female and specifically also selling it towards women too. Women were becoming, have always been, had choices in the sort of the houses and how they wanted their family and house to be run. But she specifically was targeting that, saying basically like, I know what you need. And one of my best examples though, of the way that she called herself, I think this was actually a little bit of a dig towards AIA, but she said, she called herself in 1915, a scientific designer of artistic bungalows. Mm-hmm. So I think she was specifically sort of saying, what, I can't call myself an architect? Well, then I will call myself a scientific designer of artistic bungalows. So I think that's great. So Wilburn has her own practice, and early on, in about a year after, she gets a commission basically by Mason and Weeks to build speculative homes in the MAK neighborhood. I'm so sorry. My husband just walked in and he's making faces at me, so I'll try to focus here. So Wilburn early on got a commission by Mason and Weeks to develop the MAK neighborhood and to build speculative houses. So I'll show you where we are. So this is actually Adams Street. So this is kind of, if we're going on a tour, this is just, I just wanted to give you a sense of what the neighborhood looked like. And this is actually looking south. So she was hired by Mason and Weeks to design these houses, and this is 1912. This is actually a postcard that we have of Adams Street too. So they, of course, were advertising a lot their houses and showing how beautiful they are. So this is probably 1913, and you can see it by this point, all of the houses. And it's clearly, this is actually the same view, a little bit more built up with the trees. And I gotta say, the street is actually wonderfully shaded. We've done a lot of tours, and especially over this last week when it's been incredibly hot, it's extremely cool. So with all of the shade. All right, so now we are on our first plan book, which is Southern Homes and Bungalows. So as I mentioned, Wilburn early on decided that she wanted to become a plan book architect. And she was wanting people both in rural areas and in the city to have the same access to, as she says, beautiful individual houses. She emphasizes early that a house should be a reflection of the person's individuality, and we'll definitely see some homes that are definitely individual. This was published in 1914. So this is actually, it's an 8.5 by 11 book, and there's beautiful photographs in it. And a lot of these books are actually all digitized, and I'm happy to send out the links, but they're also easily accessible to find online. But in the introduction, she kind of tells a little bit of what she's inspired by. She says, the designs shown in most books have small rooms, no fireplaces, and too fancy construction. Here you will find plans for moderate cost residences where the influence of the English half timber cottage, the Swiss chalet, and the mission bungalow is felt. Usually a combination of above styles result in a conglomerate. One of the main things that she emphasizes in her designs is the fact that they're affordable, but also there's certain aspects that help cut down on housework. And we'll kind of walk through all of those different examples as we move forward with our very first house. And actually, maybe I should, that was a lot of information right now. Are there any questions before on that introduction? Oh, okay. So I'll go back. So this is our very first house. And the reason this is our very first house is because this is probably her first house that she built in the neighborhood. This was actually built in 1912. So it was before her plan book was published. But this is a colonial revival style. This is one of her more traditional styles that she's pulling from. But it's definitely a colonial revival, 1912. It features a unique two-story portico supported by two massive Doric columns. But what's great is that there's actually two more columns under here, which this porch is completely suspended independently. She emphasizes in a lot of her designs that there should be an area for sleeping porches. And so initially in this design, as we'll see in the next slide, there's actually awnings that are over all of the porches. And in a lot of the designs too, there may have been a sleeping porch that was basically 3/4 covered around that today a lot of people have completely enclosed. But this one has plain wide eaves, which are these kind of things here. This again, the wide, super wide eaves, she may have been inspired by Prairie. They are closed eaves, which means that you can't see the rafters. And the closed eaves are also a little bit more of that colonial style versus the craftsman movement. The weighty top though, all of this is supported by a heavy granite foundation, which of course we're in DeKalb. Granite is no doubt one of our biggest products. So a heavy granite foundation, which she features in a lot of her other works. Also, you notice the windows 1/1. That could cut down in housework because there's no panes of glass. She mentions in her plan book, actually in her second plan book, she specifically says that shade enhances a lot. And this house is extremely shady, and it's actually hard to get a good view because the magnolia trees. But this is actually the plan from her plan book. So you can see the awning. And I don't believe this is actually the house that we just saw. It could be, but I don't believe it is because the sidewalk goes a different direction. But here we start to see, this one's a little bit more of her simpler designs. And we'll see a little bit more complex, kind of interesting designs moving forward. But this is her plan for this home. All right, so the second one that we'll talk about, so remember that English, the English Tudor revival, one that I pointed out pre-1920 that looked awfully similar to this design with the three gables. This one, although has more, getting a little bit more into craftsman, there's some craftsman detail with the knee brackets, just like your joint, the knee. This is actually 1911. This home, so also one of her first homes. It actually sold for $5,750 when it was first built. But there are a few details in here that reflect a lot of her other houses. The fact that there's two columns on top of plinths, it's P-L-I-N-T-H, plinth. That's what these columns are supported on. That's a feature that you'll see often, but the heavy knee brackets, a little bit of stick work here, which is The stickwork, you could say is English, but it's craftsman. But they're kind of complementary styles. The other really cool detail, and it's hard to see from here, but there's one small window, a second, and then a third one. These 3 windows actually correspond with 3 different rooms. And we'll see that in here. So I also don't believe, well, this one I'm not sure, but if you actually look, these 3 windows, they actually correspond, one to a bedroom, one to a closet, and the other one to another bedroom. She often emphasizes that she doesn't want any dark corners in her houses. And so often you have these cross ventilation, which she encourages. This particular house, and a lot of them, would have been built with a furnace, or she says you can build it with a furnace or fireplaces, which, as we see, they have a lot of fireplaces. And that's one key to figure out if your house is a Wilburn, is the fireplaces. But also, if you notice, they're in the corner. And that's another thing that she often says, is that she eliminates unnecessary corners and instead puts a fireplace. This one is a little different too. It has a back entrance with a pass through, but we start to see a lot more closets. There's a lot more closets there. This one is actually just across the street. And this one's also getting a little bit more into the prairie, but also we start to see some exposed porch rafters here, which is definitely a hallmark, though, of the craftsman movement. But this is just a Google Street View shot, so it's hard to see. But when you see it in person, it's definitely horizontal, and it's a lot more wider and substantial, as she called it. This one actually she called to be substantial than in pictures. The cool thing that we'd like to point out is the asymmetry here. There's no column, column, no column, column. This one's 1915. And this one, she says, is based on a 4-square, but with a slight projection to break up the monotony. So if you move, here's the actually in the plan, and it's a lot more wider in real life than in this plan shows. This one's a little bit unusual that it actually has one of her few that have a bedroom on the first floor. But again, a lot of fireplaces on both the bottom and top. And all of our houses so far are 4-1s. So only 1 bathroom on the top floor. This one I love to point out because she mentions individuality, and this house definitely has a lot of individuality. This is a house not for your A type of person. This one has 2 different types of columns, which is just so completely bizarre to me. If you notice, there's actually square and round columns next to each other. It's really out there. But you know what she calls it? And I have to, this is also really cool. She says, and shows a design with distinct individuality without being at all freakish. The grouping of the square and round columns give a decidedly departure from the usual sameness of veranda work. And that is definitely the case. There's also a lot of rafters, and I mean like a lot of rafters, and they're extremely wide. So there's just a lot going on. With this house, this is actually I believe this is 1912. One of the interesting things about it is actually in the hallway. So there's a hallway here. There's actually a lavatory in the closet. So this is one of the few that actually have, and she actually says that. She says the coat room with a lavatory in it will be found to save many steps. Who would have thought? Okay, so we'll move on to her next book. So this is actually, this one was published in 1921. There was a little bit of break in time between her first book and her second one. World War I happened, and she was actually a draftsperson in World War I. But this is her second book, Brick and Colonial Homes. She starts to emphasize, or starts to obviously use brick. And she says that you can choose brick as it's fireproof and that it's more, it might be a little bit pricier, but it offers a pretty exterior, but also fireproof. So this is her second book. So I'll show the houses that are in this one. This one actually is on Kings Highway. This is one of the few that will feature on there. Kings Highway, even though I showed you the plat map that has Rivers Realty, there were a few homes, and this one is actually the one right on College and Kings Highway. And it's actually one of the few that have, that are hers. But I like to show this one too, so it's a little bit more simplified. But what's interesting is that the sleeping porch is actually, it's a porch originally. Today it's been enclosed. And the owners are actually lovely. They came on a tour and they're restoring it to kind of its former glory as a Wilburn house. Here it is. Here it is today, or right before the owners are restoring it. So you could see that this was sort of actually been a porch. An open porch that's been enclosed. This one I like because it's a little different, but this is starting to get into technically more bungalow kind of territory. Technically a bungalow is referring to a house that has a porch under the main roof line, which this one has, and it's also not 2 stories, which they got rid of that restriction pretty early on, and we're starting to build 1 story, and this one's that. So this one's 1918. And they're starting to see another particular detail in here is her trellis, which she uses as her signature for a lot of her other works. This one though has some great details with this heavy dormer, and also kind of a matching matching window here. What I like are actually these little faux beams, which again are this arts and crafts English, a little bit of English cottage influence, and it makes it seem like that roof is held up by rafters when in fact it's just little bump out kind of faux carvings, but it's using these little faux details to be inspired by the original kind of Englishness and arts and craftsness. And here's the plan. In a lot of her other books, she actually has multiple versions of the same plan, but just a little bit different. So there's another version of this plan that's a little bit smaller, and it's actually on Adams, just a few houses down. And this one, so this one's actually 1918, and this is from also her second plan book. And this house was built before that plan book was published. But this is 1918, a colonial revival. And it has some, the only word that came to mind on a tour was plump. And these columns are definitely plump columns. They're rounded, they're kind of, but they're there to really hold up this weighty dormer. So this is getting a little bit into that colonial, but also Dutch colonial kind of inspiration. It's not quite a true Dutch colonial, but it's in the same realm, if you will. This one has some beautiful details on the inside, and we were lucky enough on our very first tour to go inside. But on the 2 sides, you see there's matching bay windows, and on one side is actually a den that kind of goes the entire length of the house, and so on 3 sides it's actually windows, so it's beautifully bright in this room. In the center, it's actually a central hallway. Actually, here we go. So in the center, it's actually a central kind of stair and hallway. And there originally would have been an entrance in the back that went up to a central landing. The owners, though, at the back has actually been closed, and there's a restroom down there because, like I said, a lot of her homes don't have a restroom on the bottom floor. One thing though, if you notice also about this one, is the fact that the bottom stair have actually this nice curved swoop to it. She often also uses colonnades and open staircases a lot in her homes, but it's a beautiful front porch veranda. So now we're also in bungalow territory from her second book. This one is 1914, and this again is a craftsman bungalow. And this one though starts to show a lot more definitely craftsman-isms. I mean, there's a lot of detail from the rafter tails that are curved, if you notice, to these thick, heavy beams that extend across the entire front gables, which are also held by, they're not knee brackets, but they're just brackets from a heavy eave. Again, these double and triple columns on each corner on top of granite plinths. These little cross braces, which mimic the top. So it's definitely getting a lot more of this craftsman detail. And also, if you notice this little, the venting, again, these little faux brackets up here, almost like you could display something up there. This house is actually a lot more bigger today than it looks on the outside. And that's partly because of those restrictions, restrict the outside from being the profile change that much. But if you notice, there's a lot of fireplaces in it. One thing that's different with her second book is the fact that she's including this section here, which in her first book, she doesn't quite explain a lot of details about how much it costs. But by her second book, she's putting a lot more details. And she's also on every plan, even in her first one, really going into detail about how she thinks the house would best be presented, basically. This one, she says the house being a rich cream color forms a striking contrast with the dark colored foundation and roof. So if you could see that the plans don't include any lumber or anything, it's just the plans 15. So now we're moving on to our third book, which is 1925. No, early 1920s. This one, she's definitely starting to experiment with much, much bigger homes. This includes one of her largest homes, and it's actually this one here. It's kind of the sprawling home. Some of her homes in Druid Hills especially feature a lot of these homes, but this one's where she's starting to experiment a little bit also with different styles, including Spanish Revival. She's doing a lot more English Tudor styles, and those are all featured by her third book. This one I like to feature because it's actually, this is on Adams. It's 416 Adams, but this house you actually see a lot around Decatur. And this one is definitely, we've all seen these bungalows, right? It's a bungalow, the porch is under the main roof line. It's very compact. There's a central hallway. The other little details I love is that there's a lot of built-ins. So there's built-ins here in the living room. There's a little closet here. And then I love this. Before you get to the kitchen, there's a breakfast nook, one of these benches. So I love that. And like into the kitchen. And actually, so this is the home on Adams. This one has, this is actually called a jerkin head roof. Remember that one of the first English houses that we saw looked a little inspiration by this. And that's just it became a popular little thing to add the little extra charm. Again, heavy knee brackets, stick work, the 3 windows. The most distinguishing thing is actually this portico here. And even though it is not like this portico, she says though that you can often pick and choose the different little details for it. So clearly this person wanted a little different, and even the little fan light and the 2 side lights are, looks like customized. And this round portico entrance, These have been replaced. I'm not sure what have been the original. They were wrought iron for a while, and then in the 90s, they were replaced with these classical columns here. Okay. So this one is actually on East Lake Drive. So if you're driving into past Oakhurst on East Lake Drive, right before you get to college, there's like 4 of these types of houses. So take a look next time on if you're heading towards college, it'll be on your left. This one looks just like the plan. And if you're wondering, well, is my house a Wilburn? First thing you do is look at all of the details on the outside, and then you kind of look on the inside, because it should be literally the plan. There's a lot of houses that are similar plans, and you can get into like what came first, Wilburn's plan or someone else's. But hers, there's a lot of other details, including all of those built-ins, fireplaces. This one in particular is actually, or was for sale. And if you look on Zillow, so if you want to take down, I think it's 246, I think it's like 246 East Lake. It's right before you get to where the AT&T building is. You can still see pictures of the inside on the Zillow, and you can see all of the built-ins, and they still have the breakfast nook in it. So it's a cool. And another one from Ideal Homes. This one is definitely getting into more of the English with the super steep gabled roof line, all under kind of a compact central hallway here. And this one's right next to the brick square one that I showed you. And here it is today. So this one has heavy or brackets again, stick work. This one has little details here. Tampered porch posts. This is actually a triplex. And in here, this is the interiors of a lot of her homes. So we have an open staircase. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of the open bottom landings here and the built-in furniture. Really an open reception area. She often does these open reception areas. A lot of them have these pocket doors, and she encourages people, especially in this earlier plan book, that you can open up the door and have one large reception room. And finally, I don't have any other houses from this one, but this is her 4th book in her kind of her early years. And this one is this one's all about English. So there's a lot of English inspired Tudor revival styles in here. And that is the end of on my slides. That's a lot of information. Any questions? I think, yeah, we have some time. So any questions? I know I threw a lot at you, but please, if you want me to go back to any of the slides, I'll be happy to. I can actually stop this for a second. So are there any questions about Wilburn or any of the houses that you saw? No?
You must have explained it thoroughly. I of course
feel like I just threw out
any.
a lot of information. I feel like I threw out a lot of information kind of I'm so used to having, walking. So in a way we got to see more, but I was, or look at more photographs. You're welcome, Kelly. Hi, Jan.
Hi, what happened to her after? How long did she practice? Did she pass away? When did she pass away?
She, her last book was in 1960 and she died in 1963, I believe.
She never married and she lived on Adams the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing that's so interesting. It's she was always emphasizing Southern womanhood, and She herself never had a family, but her sister that lived on Adams had several children. So she's buried at Decatur Cemetery. But I don't see as much of her work in her later years. Her later years were on trend with all of the ranches. So she has a lot of very classically styled ranches. And I don't see as often. I think this is sort of her more heyday. It was in the 19 teens into the 20s. But the MAK district is a great example, though, of her early work, and also such a high concentration in an area that she was so heavily involved with, the fact that she lived in that neighborhood. Which also makes me wonder if she would walk down the street and be like, that's not the color choice I put in my book that I would recommend.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. But again, this is kind of a synopsis of my tour that I did of this book, and it's a wonderful book, and it shows a lot more of her homes in the Druid Hills neighborhood. But not only did she do homes in Druid Hills and in Decatur, she did ones in Candler Park, Lake Claire, Piedmont, Midtown and Piedmont Park area. She actually did apartment buildings. The Wilburn condominiums right across from Piedmont is named that because of Wilburn. She also did gyms and institutional buildings. And one of the more interesting ones that I don't have any other information on is she designed Thankful Baptist Church, their gymnasium and like their addition in 1920s. And it was just listed in the newspaper as just that. So I would love to know more information, but I think that that's been sort of lost in time, especially that Thankful Baptist is no longer in existence, that sanctuary. But yeah, do you have another?
The Thankful Baptist that exists today on College is not the same.
They moved from the Beacon Hill neighborhood to that church.
Okay.
They didn't build it; it was already built, that church, and that's where they are. But yeah, the church that she would have designed the addition for no longer exists. I just think it's fascinating. It was just one small little clip in a newspaper that mentions that she is designing their addition. Well, I do want to thank you for coming on this walking tour or sofa tour. I'll be happy to answer any of the questions, and also I will send everyone that came today. I'll be happy to send you the. I send a packet after each tour, which includes links to her plan books and also all the plans that I feature. And I also did, I went a little nuts with this, but I actually labeled as many of the houses that were hers in like the greater metro area. There's about like 60 on the list. So you can click on the map and you can see the picture. She even did some as far as Griffin to Hartwell, Georgia to East Point. So they're all on the map. But with that, I want to thank you for coming, and I will
Thank you.
see you around. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. And this will be recorded too, so you'll be able to see it after.